Then at Tijuca Bar de Tijuca in Brazil, Ed Keffel took a remarkable set of pictures on 7 May 1952. Ed Kessel and Joe Martins, reporters from O Globo, a newspaper in Rio, had been sent to Tijuca Bar to photograph a groundbreaking ceremony for a new building or something. It was a political thing. And they were covering the event when at about 4:30 in the afternoon, Martins spotted an object approaching at low level, and he thought it was an airplane at first because it looked like it. But it was too low. It was just a little above the wave tops when they saw it, and they stopped talking and stood looking at it, and they remarked on how low the airplane was, and Martin says, no, that's not an airplane, it's something else. Get your camera ready. And so Joe readied his camera and started shooting pictures. And he shot a series as it approached, passed over a rocky mount rising out of the surf there, over some trees along the beach there, and then out along a beach spit where it turned up on its edge and rolled away like a coin rolling on the water as it departed. Now the interesting thing about this series of pictures is they were newspaper reporters. There were a number of people there. There were politicians present. There were scores of witnesses. They took statements from many of them. All this was published in the local newspaper, or the Rio newspaper, on the front page. A few years later, after it had been reported and after original pictures had been obtained by APROBE through Irina Granchi down there in Brazil, one of the best-known UFO researchers there, got copies from the Brazilian Air Force before they shut it back down again, who first said that it was a real object, and after some persuasion on the part of our government, changed the story, tried to substitute something else, tried to kill the pictures, and things like that. Now, I say because this was a result of interference by agents from our government is because Dr. Olavo Fontes was present. He was an Air Force flight surgeon in the Brazilian Air Force, and he was present in the general's office when the American agents came to see him on orders from here, and offered all the reasons why this should be shut down, should be stopped. And the Brazilians tried to call them back. They tried to put out cover stories to change it, just like we did the crash at Roswell. Now here's an interesting set taken at Lake Chauvet near Clermont-Ferrand in France on the 18th of July in 1950. Now we're still in 1952, you see. And this is about 4:15 in the afternoon when Mr. Andre Fragnali, an engineer, took a series of 4 photographs of an object traveling from west to east in the sky over Lake Chauvet. He was there with a truck, and he had stopped his truck, and he got out and opened a lunch pail and was getting ready to eat a sandwich when he saw the objects approaching. And he saw that it was metallic. It was not an airplane. It was disc-shaped, reflecting the sun's rays from its edge. And it appeared lighter on the top and darker underneath, and it was completely silent. And he prepared his camera and started taking pictures. He took 4 good black and white pictures at fairly low level as it passed him, and then as it began to ascend over the lake, and then departed at a steep angle, leaving the scene. These 4 pictures are among the clearest ones taken at that time. And he even watched it with binoculars for part of the time. He used a good camera. He used a Zeiss-Icon 24 by 36 camera with a Tessar f45 lens, which gave him sharp photographs that lent themselves to analysis even in those days. Another object or photo of interest came to attention in 1952, also 19th of July. No, we're still in 52. This is early in the thing here. At Puerto Maldonado on the border between Peru and Brazil, Officer Domingo Troncoso, a customs inspector for Peru at the border station there, was the only one that had a camera. When many people at the border station saw a cigar-shaped object passing from right to left across the sky, and it passed over the river that makes the boundary between Brazil and Peru at that point, and it was low enough to cast a reflection in the waters of the river. Judging from that, you could, since you have the reflection in the water and the object in the sky, you can triangulate and get an approximate altitude or angle of elevation from the photographer. So he took the one picture as it moved along. It was moving from right to left rather slowly, about the speed of an airplane flying, and trailing what looked like a trail of thick white smoke from the back of it. When that trail of residue settled to the ground, it turned out to be a mass of thin, fibery threads, like spider webs or flax. Today we call the same phenomena angel hair, from the angel hair you put around the bottom of a Christmas tree. And when this material has been analyzed, it has a composition something like that. It's made of boron, silicon, aluminum, and a number of other things that are present in the air that seem to be polymerized by some natural process in the either around or in the wake or in the exhaust of whatever propulsion device is using. It's a natural polymerization process that produces these fibers that are really strange fibers too, because there've been a number of them, because they're tough, have good tensile strength. If you use inert instruments to pull them apart, if you touch them with your fingers, they turn to jelly, and they break up easily. In fact, they'll collapse of their own weight. If you put some in the palm of your hand, it just, in time, from the heat of the palm of the hand, melts down into a jelly-like mass and then turns green and then evaporates away. But this stuff has come down all over the country in the wake of UFOs, even to the extent of falling inches deep in the wake of a UFO over an area that covers 15 or 20 city blocks. A case like that happened in Bakersfield, California. There was a case in England where a fall of angel hair covered the streets and sidewalks and roofs of a town 4 inches deep, the whole town. Another interesting one, still in 1952 now, 52 was a banner year, leading up probably to the big wave in France in 1953 and 54, but in late July of 1952, we began to experience overflights over Washington. The public has been told about one, but there was a buildup of this. They began about the 22nd or 23rd of July of 1952. The first objects appeared over Washington, passed through the prohibited airspace, flew on, and disappeared. Then, on the 27th of July, a flock of them appeared over Washington at night, like a half a dozen or more, that moved through the prohibited airspace in formation. They turned the searchlights on, they sent interceptors up, and the objects successfully eluded all attempts to get them on gun camera film. Then on the night of the 29th of July, we had a score of them appear over the Capitol, and they watched them on radar. They chased them with relays of fighters. Interceptors called up one after another. They ordered one F-102 to ram one if he could, and he put it in afterburner and tried to ram one that was in front of him, and it just flew circles around him as he was flying in afterburner past him, just circled him fastest he could go. So there was a lot of activity going on there. And on that afternoon of the 29th of July, at about 4:30 in the afternoon at Passaic, New Jersey, just above Washington, Mr. George Stock and his old father were standing out in front of Stock's yard, his house there, where he repaired lawnmowers, and they spotted a strange aircraft approaching low over the trees in the distance to the east, I guess it was. And they watched it for a minute. They could see that it wasn't not an airplane, that it wasn't a balloon, it wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't anything identifiable. And George told his father, keep an eye on it, I'm going to go get the camera. And his dad stayed out there in the front there to keep an eye on it, and George came out in time to start taking pictures, and he snapped the first picture of it still on its approach towards his house there. And then he rolled the film as it passed over their heads and started passing along the ridge line of their house. They could just see it above the ridge line. He got a second picture as it neared the ridge line, another one as it was near the far end of the roof line of the house, then one where it's out over the backyard passing away, and another one where it's moving farther away, and one more picture. They got a total of 6 pictures. Now they got them in the camera, and it was clearly nothing mundane. It was so low they could have thrown something, a rock, and hit it as it passed over them. So they discussed this, and by now a neighbor had joined them also, and they decided to take the camera and the roll of film to the local newspaper and tell them the story. So they took it to the Morning Call there. And the Morning Call newspaper photo lab took the film out of the camera, processed the film, made the prints, and printed the pictures on the front page of the Passaic Morning Call. By evening of the day they appeared in the newspaper, a man came to Stock's house identifying himself as a CIA agent, which is strange because the CIA is not supposed to be operating in the domestic borders of the United States. The CIA jurisdiction is beyond the national borders, and FBI has a jurisdiction inside the national borders. But we find the CIA meddling all over the place here, and I don't know how they get away with it or why they do it. But anyway, the man identified himself as a CIA officer, demanded the pictures. George refused to give them up, and finally, after some negotiation, the man agreed to settle for the negatives. He'd let George keep the pictures, and he wanted to have them take them someplace and have them tested, which George agreed to after the man provided a signed, written receipt for the documents with an address and a telephone number that checked at the time. And he carried them away, and then when George tried to get them back, he tried repeatedly to get his negatives back, and there was always an excuse why they couldn't return them. This went on for 3 months. Finally, he got angry and got an attorney who was going to file a lawsuit against the office, and they returned 5 of the 6 negatives with copy prints, but they never returned the 6th one. And George has never been able to get it back. He now has passed on. The pictures went into the hands of August Roberts, who also has passed on, and now they're in my possession. But we've never found the 6th picture.
I think, whichever explanation we use is going to be a theory.
Yeah.
And theory is always different from reality. I mean, we can probably create, more than one theory about the phenomenon. But I think the least useful approach is to try to deal with this phenomenon in the context of Cartesian Newtonian materialistic science, because there we have just the alternative. I mean, this is either a spaceship, a hardware, from another galaxy, or it is hallucination. It is a phenomenon, that suggests mental disease in the people who have seen it, or fraud or something in that category. And I think it's not difficult to realize that that's a fundamentally wrong approach. I mean, let's say if it were a spaceship, if it were really advanced technology, we know enough about the solar system. We know they would not be coming from the planets of the solar system. So the next possibility, is those are worlds that are light years away. So they would have to be using technology that we can't even imagine at this point. They would have to be either supraluminal speeds, I mean faster than light, or interdimensional. We have concepts like hyperspace, sort of technology that would be able to step out of this time-space continuum into hyperspace and then re-enter somewhere else. So if we would be dealing with this kind of technology, we couldn't ourselves distinguish those phenomena from hallucinations. I mean, this would be like bringing a helicopter and color television to the pygmies, or something like that. So that's not a very useful way of thinking about it.
Dr. Richard Haynes is a physiological psychologist who has conducted numerous research and development projects for NASA Ames Research Center in San Jose, California. One such project was the design of the Proximity Operations Research Mockup, a spacecraft docking simulator, which will eventually assist Space Station Freedom astronauts in the docking of visiting spacecraft. Dr. Haynes' interest in the UFO phenomenon began some 30 years ago. Since then, he has published several books on the subject, most recently, Project Delta, a study of multiple UFO sightings.
I first got interested in the UFO subject back in the 60s when I was doing some research on rendezvous and docking for our space program. And I had a laboratory back then that would allow me to simulate the way objects look to the astronauts when they're in outer space. And so I began to discover rather quickly that under the right lighting conditions, I could fool ask the person to look at a target situation with a black background and very bright front illumination like we have in orbit, and the person was totally unable to describe what they were seeing. They would be inaccurate in terms of the object size and shape, its distance, of course. The basic characteristics were just very misunderstood and misinterpreted. And so this led me to think that, well, I could explain UFOs. As a skeptic, if I could do this in the laboratory, then these sightings must simply be unidentified natural phenomena. And so that's how I got started, because I set out to disprove that there were such things, because I could set them up in the laboratory and fool people pretty completely. Well, after a number of years of talking to very credible witnesses, including pilots of many kind of aircraft, I came to understand that I was wrong. That as a matter of fact, there is something very definitely here that's important, that deserves serious study, and that I could not explain. I've been asked a number of times how I go about analyzing a photograph of an anomalous phenomenon. Let's call it a UFO. Well, that's a good question, and it's a complex question with many levels of answers. And to make it simple, let me suggest that no single photograph that is unexplained is sufficient in itself to prove anything. And so what I like to do is take a look at the entire context in which a photograph finds itself. What do I mean by that? First of all, there's the photographer. And the photographer plays a very central role, not only in taking the photograph, but in presenting the photograph to someone else. Perhaps in providing the context information surrounding the photograph. In addition to the photographer, then you have the camera, the condition of the camera. Was it malfunctioning? How current is it in terms of its ability to take automatic exposures rather than manual exposures? You have the film that's in the camera. Is that film state-of-the-art? Was it properly chosen for the conditions, let's say the nighttime sky? This says something about not only the film and the camera, but the cameraman's ability to use proper judgment. In addition, you have the development of the film. Who did the developing? What safeguards were taken to prevent double exposures in the development process? Assuming now that the camera did not malfunction, and assuming the cameraman was not trying to carry out a hoax, and so forth. In addition to that, then you have now the developed negative. What about the processing, the enlargements, for instance? Can we, what's called dodge in or double expose a disc-like image on a rather prosaic background? Finally, you have the whole story that surrounds the time and the place the camera and the photographer and the film find themselves. And does that story match up with what's on the film? And when you take all of those events together and you examine each one carefully, and then you subject the image on the negative, the original negative, to certain special processing, let's call them photo enhancements for now, and you find no ambiguities and you find no contradictions, you've got something. You've got a real photograph which can stand the test of time, and which is then at the stage of going to the next step, which is trying to match up that image on the photograph with known phenomenon, first of all. After you have exhausted all known phenomenon, only then do you progress to unknown or hypothetical phenomenon, postulated phenomenon, such as UFO, such as extraterrestrial craft, for instance. But I don't advocate doing that until I have exhausted all prosaic explanations. Over the years of looking at this phenomenon, I have studied quite a few photographs which just cannot be explained by prosaic explanation. And the reason why they can't be explained so readily is, again, where they were taken and when they were taken and the conditions under which they were taken. That's as important as the shape of the object that's seen. So, for instance, Jacques Vallée and I have analyzed a very interesting photograph from Costa Rica, taken from an airplane, looking straight down. The airplane was at 10,000 feet altitude, and the background of this object is a lake. And so the object, or whatever it is hovering over the surface of a lake. And by knowing the optics of the camera, the focal length, and so forth, we know the angular width of the object. We know its absolute distance. It can't be more than 10,000 feet. So we were able to calculate the size of this object. And what we find, based upon our analyses, is, I think, clearly a three-dimensional object, not a flat or two-plane object, with some very interesting symmetry in the surface structure, or the surface reflections, let's call it. In addition to that, I find two edges which are very smooth and continuous and parallel to each other, which think of a penny kind of seen at an angle. The two sides of the edges are rather smooth, relative, and parallel to each other. On the other hand, at the far side, I find a very undulating and irregular edge, which is very intriguing. It raises some interesting questions. And it suggests that the object, whatever it is, may possibly be submerged into the water. This actually may represent the wave border or boundary as the object is at an angle to the water surface. The object is anomalous in that case, first of all, because there is no known, no visible means of propulsion or lift in this case. The second case, the second point is that we have a photograph taken 20 seconds before it and 20 seconds after it by an automatic camera with nobody looking at the camera. It's just doing its own exposures automatically. The object is not visible in the previous or the following, which tells us something that the object had to be appearing within that 20-second period and then disappearing after it. Well, that's anomalous. Airplanes don't do that. So we were able to calculate that if the object entered linearly and flew across the camera field of view, how fast would it have to travel in order to show up just in the middle frame? And the answer is in almost 1,000 miles an hour. The object had to be very big if it was far away, and on the order of 800 to 1,000 feet across, which makes it anomalous. Another explanation would be that it's a smaller object closer to the airplane. Nobody on board the airplane saw this. It was about 5 men on board the airplane doing a routine mapping. Well, that's just one example of a disc-shaped, three-dimensional object reflecting sunlight realistically under following the laws of optics, reflection, let's say, where the object just cannot be explained as an airplane or a kite or a frisbee or some model of some sort, or a balloon, or many ors. And after exploring all these options and doing the analysis, we're left with a UFO, an unidentified flying object. Well, in this particular case from British Columbia, Here's a color blow-up of what the Mrs. D.R. Obtained with her Mamiya camera. And it was a beautiful morning, a clear day with a few clouds in the sky, and she's taking a picture of this mountaintop right here in order to prove to her husband that she could take a good quality photograph. He'd been kidding her about this. She did not notice, nor did anyone else, a very interesting shaped object up here in the sky until she got the film back from the processor. I found out from a geometric analysis that the tip of the mountaintop was very, very close to the optical center of the frame, which would back up the photographer's statement that she was taking a picture of the mountain. I think that if she had seen the UFO and in fact was trying to perpetrate a hoax, she would have centered the object more in the center of the field. I have another drawing here which is a reconstruction of the object as seen from the side, showing elevation angles and sun angles and so forth. And this analysis matches very nicely the locations of the solar reflections off the surface of the body of the craft or whatever it is. And finally, we have the certified land survey that we did at site. The mountaintop was 7,580 feet from the viewing location, with an elevation above the local horizon of a little over 24 degrees. These are all, I think, important points to be made when analyzing this particular case. Finally, I have an enlarged digital enhancement of the object showing rather large pixel groupings, and we can see the reflection off of a protrusion on the top of the object, as well as a bright solar reflection off of the front edge of the object as well. I've spent a good deal of time looking at this case, and it is fascinating for what the object could be. We know what it's not. It deserves a lot of serious study by qualified people. The negative's available if anybody wants to do more work on it. Here's a good example where we have a couple who has no particular motives for hoaxing this sort of thing, have not made any money off of it, and yet they're willing to share the negative for further analysis. In this next case, I have 3 black and white photographs taken in Tiraspol, Russia on April 20th of 1990 between 6:10 and 6:30 local time, p.m. 3 teenage boys this is a Moldavian Republic of the SSR at that time. 3 teenage boys were out skateboarding, and it was about time to go home for dinner. One of them had a camera with him, a Zenit Model E with black and white ASA 250 film, speed film in it, and a very interesting dome object shows up in the sky. The sky is fairly foggy and diffuse, and I received this case from an investigator in Tiraspol who asked me to analyze it. Well, he provided a drawing that I have here showing the estimated flight path of the object as seen from above, and then we see each of the 3 photographs enlarged of the object. The object appears to be the same object in terms of its length-width ratio and other characteristics. It's a very interesting case which again proves that UFOs are being photographed in foreign countries, and there's a lot of evidence from around the world actually on this subject. A very interesting UFO event happened in Belgium over a number of months with literally thousands of eyewitnesses on the ground. This case involved photographs, it involved radar, it involved military jet intercepts, and a highly credible analysis, photographic analysis of a 35 millimeter photograph that was taken from the ground, a nighttime shot, of what appears to be a triangular airform with very bright lights, one at each corner of the triangle, and then a orange-red light pretty much at the center of the object as well. 2 books have been published by the UFO group in Belgium, in Brussels, documenting a great deal of the evidence, including eyewitness drawings and photographs and so forth, other evidence. This object was tracked at very high speed by the official military authorities, the Air Force. As a matter of fact, one of the leading Air Force officers at the time acknowledged that he could not explain what this phenomenon was. It remains unidentified. To me, one of the fascinating and valuable aspects of this Belgian case from 1989 was that when the private investigators, the UFO investigators in Brussels, went to the military officials, the officials were ready and willing and able to cooperate. And if we can find this level of cooperation in Belgium, we should be able to find this level of cooperation in America. So once again, we have a foreign case, highly credible witnesses, photographic evidence, radar evidence, visual evidence, all correlating to the same space and time. I don't know what more evidence a scientist would want to take a look at. And to claim that there's no photograph, or there's no physical evidence is just, that's not true. To automatically exclude verbal testimony, as some people would like to do in this case, might be convenient to avoid looking at the evidence. On the other hand, verbal evidence is oftentimes used in courts of law to bring people to justice. And why that level of proof is not adequate in this domain, UFO studies, I don't understand, except perhaps on one basis, and that would be a simple denial mechanism. That perhaps as a culture, as a species, we are in denial about this phenomenon. Evidence, as I said earlier, of a photographic nature is not sufficient in itself. But when we take a look at this photographic evidence in combination with the narrative, with the social situation that surrounds it, with the knowledge of the camera, the film, the processing, and so forth and so on, we are in a much stronger position to say that the evidence is compelling and is suggestive. And I again urge my colleagues from many points of view, many academic disciplines, to take a look at the evidence, come to your own conclusions, rather than just accepting the conclusions of other people.
The mere existence of alien spacecraft should not be considered a matter of national security. Matter of fact, at the point we're now at, it's a matter of national insecurity that the government feels it has to lie to its citizens.
I'm sympathetic to the view expressed by Dr. John Mack that perhaps this phenomenon, whatever it represents, is meant to break us out of that paradigm, to make us think in other ways. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. That rings sort of true. I don't know how to proceed any other way than as a journalist would proceed, however, and that is going after the documents, trying to find witnesses. I suspect that for this thing to ever answer itself, for us to really get a firm grip on what really is going on, it'll take one of two things. One is somebody from the inside with impeccable credentials who clearly was in a position to know, who comes forward and spills the beans and can demonstrate, can show us those beans. That's number one. Or number two, the visitors themselves, wherever they're from, wherever they're here, make a demonstration of some sort. We joke about them landing on the White House lawn. Well, that would work. That would do it. Land in a craft in which we could kick the tires and we can clearly see that these are beings from somewhere else. Whitley Strieber said it years ago. He said, these beings are the true architects of the secrecy. They could break this open anytime they want to. They choose not to for whatever reason.
T-minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, Go for main engine start. 3 main engines up and burning. 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery and the Upper Atmosphere Research Satellite, entering a new era studying the Earth's environment from space.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Mission Control Houston now controlling the flight of Discovery.
On September 15, 1991, the Space Shuttle Discovery captured on videotape several anomalous objects moving in unusual trajectories. 4 NASA scientists were asked to look at the footage, concluding, "The objects seen are orbiter-generated debris illuminated by the sun. The flicker of light is the result of firing of the attitude thrusters on the orbiter, and the abrupt motions of the particles result from the impact of gas jets from the thrusters." To illustrate the sequence of events, the flash is the thruster firing. The abrupt change in direction of the particles are a result of the gas jet which accelerates the debris. Dr. Jack Kasher, a physicist at the University of Nebraska, has recently completed an exhaustive analysis of the event.
What I'm going to tell you is the result of my analysis as a physicist and a scientist, just taking the data and seeing where it goes. And the bottom line of my investigation is I started out my investigation assuming that there were ice particles and trying along the way to prove that there were ice particles. And I found out that, at least if you take the data that I've got and the analysis that I've gotten, that I've done of it, that's a completely untenable position. The camera was focused at infinity, and any little specks would just be invisible. And you can tell that's true because toward the end of the segment, the camera pans down and looks at the side of the cargo bay, and you can see it's grossly out of focus. Then it focuses and then turns toward the front. So it was focused at infinity, so any little particles near the camera don't work. Ice particles don't work. And after that, there aren't many options. Meteors, absolutely not. They don't change direction. And space junk and satellites don't change direction. There are no other options. These are objects that are clearly at times above the air glow, and so they're maneuvering, and they are in outer space. Therefore, they're spacecraft. I don't see any other interpretation that you can have. They are some kind of spacecraft.
At the time this event was recorded, the shuttle was northwest of Australia, moving southeast into the sun. Here is the camera view from the shuttle just prior to the event. What appears to be the horizon is actually the top of the Earth's airglow. The Earth's physical horizon is located about 60 miles below the top of the airglow. Here you see the changes of direction of several of the objects after the flash. The main object will appear moving to the left, followed shortly by a flash, at which time the objects abruptly change direction, followed by 2 streaks. This is a close-up of the same sequence, screen right, showing several objects at the time of the flash. Note the regular pulsations of the objects, which is inconsistent with tumbling ice particles. Shortly after, the camera pans down to the shuttle bay. The jerkiness is a result of the camera movement. Note this object, when silhouetted, appears to have the shape of a domed disk. Later in the mission, this object shot through the upper corner of the frame. Enlarged and slowed down, it also appears to be disc-shaped with a regular pulsation. First, a simple observation. If the particles are accelerated by a blast from the attitude adjustment thrusters, then it would follow that the camera, which is attached to the shuttle, would register the change in attitude of the shuttle. Dr. Kasher has calculated that change would be about 6 degrees. However, no change in the camera frame occurs throughout the entire sequence. Another simple observation is if the abrupt motions of the particles result from the impact of gas jets from the thrusters, then the trajectories of the objects should trace back to the source of the acceleration on the shuttle. As shown in this illustration, that is not the case. This is a graph of the main object's movement over time. The short downward section here indicates that the object is moving to the left in the frame. The upward section indicates that the object has changed direction and is moving to the right in the frame. This area, which corresponds to the flash, indicates that the object has stopped dead in its tracks for a full half second.
Now you tell me how this could work. If it's an ice particle, it's somewhere up about here. And I can prove, using the methods that I just pointed out, that before the flash, before the pre-flash, it's moving like this, in this direction. And the reason it stops then has to be that something is pushing back in this direction. Obviously, that can't be the shuttle. So the pre-flash explanation doesn't work. The reason that object, whatever it is, stops is not one of the attitude adjuster rockets. So we have a tremendous problem because it stops right at or just before the main flash. And it simply can't do that if it's an ice particle.
Finally, Dr. Kasher has calculated the velocity of the main object and compared this to the known velocity of the thruster aboard the shuttle. For example, if the object is an ice particle, we can easily determine it to be 65 feet from the shuttle. At the flash, the object stops for a full half second before accelerating in a different direction. If the flash is a thruster firing, then the gas jet takes a half second to reach the object and begin to accelerate it. We therefore multiply distance with time to arrive at the exhaust velocity of the thruster, which should compare to the known velocity supplied by NASA of 8,400 feet per second. Yet these two figures are not even close to each other. To illustrate this another way, in order for this sequence to work, the object would have to be 22 miles from the shuttle. Knowing the direction that the object is accelerated, the thruster would have to be 15 miles from the shuttle, which clearly cannot be the case.
So what does this all come down to? I've really tried to do a genuine, honest, scientific inquiry into this. The reason I did it, of course, is because I didn't think the objects would end up being ice particles, and that implies that they are spacecraft, which would be a very important thing. But I tried to be fair in what I did, and I didn't push my conclusions. And at times, it got to the point where I thought I would have to drop the whole thing because I got to points where I thought it was going to fall apart. Did not fall apart, and you've seen the analysis. There really is virtually nothing that supports the ice particle theory from the data that I have that are subjected to the analysis. And there are, on the other side of the coin, at least 5 proofs that the objects were not ice particles, therefore spacecraft. And they were either extraterrestrial or terrestrial. Obviously, that's the dichotomy that we have. And if they were terrestrial, that implies a whole new level of technology that's levels and levels beyond anything that we have on this Earth. You saw some of those accelerations that we discussed, tremendous accelerations that would flatten any human pilot far beyond the capability of any craft that we have. So whether they're terrestrial or extraterrestrial, they're far beyond conventional programs. If they're terrestrial, that implies that we've been working on them for decades. Also implies that the Star Wars program is, I guess you might say, a sham, because we already have craft that are far beyond what we expected with Star Wars, and so that's been all kind of a waste of money. If they're extraterrestrial, it's really big news. We're being visited by other planets. It's also scary because those streaks that went through there, you can interpret those as well as I can. One possible explanation is that we were firing at them. That's a scary scenario. And so, once again, my analysis is a scientific one that at least satisfies me that those objects were not ice particles. And beyond that, we're all in the same boat together because we're speculating, and I have no evidence to prove what one was or the other, or whether one explanation works or the other, but it opens up the door, it opens up the can of worms to discussing some of these questions.
It tells me that there is a phenomenon, that there are extraterrestrials here beyond all shadow of a doubt in my mind. And I have other evidence at the same time. So this is corroborative evidence to more empirical evidence that I run into occasionally. And it simply tells me that somebody else is here. Now, the other thing that stands out in my mind is, and this comes up frequently when I'm lecturing someplace, they say, well, who are they and where do they come from? Well, the problem there is it's not a simple they, it's very complex, and it's not a few theys, it's literally thousands of them coming from thousands of different origins on 1,000 different kinds of business, using 1,000 different kinds of craft. They're all generally disc shaped, but they're all different in detailed construction, materials, operation, behavior, everything is infinitely different. Even the beings aboard, even though a third of them are humans, placental humans like us, within that third, there's infinite differentiation, difference in skin color, difference in size of the nose, size of the eyes, morphology, shape of the face, muscles or no muscles, length of the fingers, number of knuckles on the fingers. All kinds of things can be different, and the same thing with the grades. There's infinite variation there, and they all, unless they're identical, they are all probably coming from someplace, from different places. They're here on different business. They have different kinds of propulsion systems. Some of them carry fuel of some kind, like little pellets, and some of them don't carry any fuel at all. They harvest their energy from the space around them, wherever they happen to be. And those all are technology we haven't even approached yet. We don't know how to operate a craft with no fuel. It gathers all of its energy from the ambient space around it as it goes. But others, thousands of others, have solved this technology. And that tells us nothing. It tells us we can do it. All we have to do is find out how we want to do it. And there may be a lot of different ways to do it because they're not all doing it the same way.